The wind howling through the Bitterroot Range did not simply blow, it screamed. It tore through the high passes with a violent, jagged fury that could strip the heat from a man's bones in minutes. The locals in the scattered lowland settlements called the winter of 1887 the Great White Death. It was an unforgiving season, a relentless barrage of ice and isolation that caused towering pines to freeze solid and snap in the dead of night, the sound echoing down the canyons like artillery fire. In this frozen hellscape, Elias Thorne found a strange kind of peace. Elias was a man who had long ago traded the complications of the world below for the brutal honesty of the mountains. He was a towering figure draped in heavy snow-dust wolf pelts, his face weathered by sun wind and old sorrows. He carried the scent of pine resin-oiled leather and wood smoke. Years ago, he had worn a tin star. He had believed in the rigid lines of the law right up until the law had failed him and taken everything he loved. Now he preferred the company of silence. He ran his trap lines, traded furs for black powder and coffee once a season, and lived as a ghost among the peaks. It was mid-January. The sky was a bruising flat gray, heavy with the promise of yet another blizzard. Elias was tracking a wounded bull elk, his snowshoes hissing softly against the waist-deep powdery snow. He moved with a practiced predatory stillness, conserving energy in a landscape that demanded a heavy toll for every step. The trail was leading him down into a steep, treacherous ravine known as Whispering Hollow. It was a bad place to be in the winter, prone to deadly snowdrifts and sudden avalanches. As he crested a rocky ridge, pausing to let his lungs adjust to the thin or freezing air, something caught his eye. It was not a movement, but a disruption in the endless white and gray canvas of the valley. Smoke, it was a meager, pathetic thread of slate gray smoke, fighting a losing battle against the downdrafts. It rose from the skeletal remains of an old, rotting logging cabin, half buried beneath a massive drift of snow in the hollow below. Elias lowered his heavy Sharps .50, 90 rifle resting the barrel across his forearm. His dark, discerning eyes narrowed against the biting wind. No one came up to Whispering Hollow in the dead of winter. The nearest stagecoach stop was a punishing 4-day ride on horseback, and the trails were currently impassable. If there was a greenhorn homesteader trapped down there, they were already dead or currently freezing to death. If it was a gang of cattle rustlers waiting out the storm, they were foolish to choose a structure that looked ready to collapse under the weight of the winter sky. Abandoning the elk trail, Elias adjusted his grip on the rifle and began the slow, arduous descent. The snow crunched loudly under his weight, a sound amplified by the deathly silence of the surrounding woods. He utilized the cover of massive snow-laden spruces, approaching the cabin from its blind side. The structure was in a miserable state. The roof dipped dangerously inward, groaning under a foot of fresh powder. The single front window had been boarded up from the inside with splintered planks, and the heavy oak door was sealed shut by a thick layer of ice. Around the latch, there were frantic, shallow gouges in the wood someone had tried to hack their way out, or perhaps tried to keep something out. Yet that thin trail of smoke persisted from the crumbling stone chimney, carrying the faint, acrid smell of burning floorboards. They were out of firewood. Elias stood outside the door, the wind whipping his long, dark coat around his boots. He unslung his rifle, holding it loosely but ready. He raised a massive, leather-gloved fist and struck the heavy oak door twice. The thuds were dull, swallowed instantly by the wind. Inside, the reaction was instantaneous. The heavy metallic clack-clack of a Winchester lever-action rifle chambering a round cut through the sound of the storm. It was a sharp, distinct noise that Elias knew intimately. "You take one step closer to that door, and I will put a hole clean through it," a voice rasped. Elias paused, his breath pluming in the freezing air. The voice was ragged, torn by dehydration and smoke inhalation, but it was undoubtedly a woman's voice. A woman out here, alone in the Great White Death. "Put the hammer down, ma'am," Elias called out. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, calm and resonant, cutting through the thin timber of the door. "I am not here to do you harm. I saw your smoke from the ridge. You are burning your own shelter. I figure you might need pulling out of this icebox." "I don't need anything from you," the woman shouted, the effort throwing her into a fit of wet, rattling coughs. "You turn your boots around and walk back the way you came. I'm armed and I ain't afraid to shoot." Elias did not move. His eyes scanned the perimeter of the cabin again. There were no tracks. The snow was completely undisturbed. That meant she had been holed up inside this freezing box since before the last blizzard hit, at least 5 days ago. She had no firewood left outside. She was tearing up the interior, burning the very floor she slept on just to keep the frostbite at bay. She was starving, freezing, and cornered. "If I walk away," Elias said, his tone devoid of judgment, speaking only the harsh truth of the mountains, "the wind is going to drop the temperature another 20 degrees by nightfall. That roof is bowing. It will cave in on you, or the cold will simply stop your heart while you sleep. I have dried venison hot coffee and a hatchet to cut you some proper timber." A long, agonizing silence stretched between them. Elias could hear the wind whistling through the cracks in the cabin logs. He could almost hear the frantic beating of her heart. Finally, the scrape of a heavy wooden crossbar sliding out of its iron brackets echoed from inside. The icy door groaned in protest, sticking for a moment before yielding. It cracked open just 2 inches. A single bloodshot eye stared out at him from the darkness. Below it, the cold black muzzle of a Winchester 1873 was pointed directly at Elias's chest. "Drop your rifle in the snow, now," she ordered. Her voice trembled a mixture of profound weakness and sheer desperation. "Take 3 steps back. Keep your hands where I can see them." Elias understood the danger of a wounded animal. He slowly knelt, laying his heavy Sharps rifle gently into the powder. He stood back up, raising his gloved hands to shoulder height, and took 3 deliberate steps backward. The door opened wider, protesting against the packed ice. Standing in the threshold was a woman who looked as though she had been dragged through hell and left to rot. She was small, swimming in a man's oversized, blood-stained canvas duster coat. Beneath that, she was wrapped in a filthy, moth-eaten wool blanket. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollowed out by hunger smeared with black soot from the smoky fire. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin a sickly, translucent pale. But it was her eyes that held Elias in place. They were a piercing, vivid hazel burning with a fierce, feral will to survive. She was terrified, shivering violently, yet her grip on the heavy rifle, though trembling, was remarkably disciplined. "I'm Cora," she said, her breath catching in her throat. "Cora Vance. And if you make one sudden move, mister, I promise you I won't miss." "Elias Thorne," he replied, dipping his chin respectfully. "And I don't doubt your aim, Mrs. Vance, but you are fighting the wrong enemy right now. The mountain is trying to kill you, and it is winning." He didn't ask for permission. He didn't wait for her to invite him in. Elias simply turned his back on her, a deliberate show of trust, and walked to the side of the cabin. Leaning against the eaves was a massive dead spruce tree that had fallen years ago. Elias drew a heavy, razor-sharp hatchet from his belt. For the next 3 hours, Elias worked in grueling, silent labor. The sound of his hatchet biting into the frozen wood echoed rhythmically through the clearing. He chopped the dead wood into manageable logs. He climbed the treacherous, icy slope of the roof and carefully shoveled off the heaviest accumulations of snow, relieving the pressure on the groaning crossbeams. Cora stayed by the open door the entire time. She refused to sit down, the Winchester never leaving her hands. She watched him with a paranoid, unflinching intensity, waiting for the moment he would turn on her. But Elias never even looked her way. He simply worked his broad shoulders rising and falling, his breath steaming in the bitter air. When he finally gathered a massive armful of split firewood and stepped into the dim, smoke-filled cabin, the stench of sickness and desperation hit him hard. The interior was stripped bare. She had indeed been burning the floorboards. A gaping hole in the center of the room revealed the frozen earth beneath. In the far corner lay a pathetic nest of straw and a single battered leather saddlebag. Elias dropped the wood loudly onto the stone hearth. He fed the dying embers, coaxing a roaring, bright fire back to life. The warmth immediately began to push back the bone-deep chill of the room. He unslung his heavy leather pack. Without a word, he tossed a thick brick of hardtack and a large cut of dried salted venison onto her lap. Cora stared at the food. For a second, the tough facade cracked. She fell upon the meat like a starved wolf, tearing at it with her teeth, momentarily forgetting the rifle resting against her knees. Elias took a battered tin pot from his pack, scooped it full of clean snow from outside, and set it over the fire. He added a handful of crushed chicory root and coffee beans. As the snow melted and the dark liquid began to boil, a rich, comforting aroma filled the small space. "Why are you out here, Mrs. Vance?" Elias asked, softly pouring the black coffee into a tin cup and setting it on the floorboards near her. This is not homesteader country. The passes have been snowed in for weeks. You did not wander up into Whispering Hollow by accident. Cora stopped chewing. She swallowed hard, clutching the tin cup with both hands, letting the heat seep into her freezing fingers. The feral, cornered look returned to her eyes.
That is none of your concern, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice regaining a fraction of its strength. You have done your good deed for the winter. You chopped wood, you gave me meat. Now leave.
Alea stood up. He was incredibly tall in the cramped confines of the cabin. His gaze drifted slowly to the far corner, settling on the battered leather saddlebag resting on the straw. Even in the dim firelight, he could see the deep dark stains crusted into the leather. Blood, a significant amount of it, and by the pattern, it wasn't from a hunted animal.
Keep the fire hot, Elias said, entirely ignoring her demand. He adjusted his wolf pelt collar. Don't burn the green wood I stacked outside, or the smoke will blind you and choke you out.
He turned, picked up his heavy rifle from where he had left it leaning by the doorframe, and stepped out into the howling blizzard. He pulled the damaged door shut behind him, leaving Cora Vance alone once more in the freezing wilderness. Ilias did not go far. Elias did not go far. To leave a wounded cornered woman alone in the Great White Death was a guaranteed death sentence, regardless of how much firewood he had chopped or how much meat he had left behind. He found a shallow rocky overhang about a half-mile up the eastern ridge, shielded from the worst of the howling wind by a thick, imposing stand of ancient ponderosa pines. Here he made a cold camp. He didn't dare build a fire. The smoke would give away his position if anyone else was tracking her, and the sudden light would ruin his night vision in the blinding snow. He simply wrapped himself tightly in his heavy wolf pelts, pulled his wide-brimmed hat down low over his eyes, and sat with his broad back against the freezing granite. The heavy Sharps rifle rested comfortably across his thighs. He didn't sleep. The Bitterroot Mountains demanded constant vigilance, and his mind was heavily occupied by the puzzle of Cora Vance. The frontier was vast and unforgiving, a magnet for runaways, outlaws, and broken people desperately trying to carve out a second chance. But a woman braving the high, treacherous pass of Whispering Hollow in the dead of winter, entirely alone, was an anomaly that gnawed at Elias's instincts. He replayed the encounter in his mind. He remembered the heavy dark blood caked onto the canvas of her oversized coat. He remembered the blood pooling on the leather saddlebag in the corner of her miserable shelter. And above all, he remembered the frantic, cornered animal look in her striking hazel eyes. She was running. And whoever or whatever she was running from had driven her to choose a slow, freezing death over the prospect of being caught. Over the next 3 days, Elias Thorne became an unspoken phantom fixture in Cora's brutal existence. He established a relentless routine of survival. At first light, when the temperature plummeted so low that the air felt like shards of shattered glass in his lungs, he would emerge from the timber. He never knocked on the heavy oak door again. He simply set to work. On the second morning, he dragged a freshly dressed mule deer carcass through the waist-deep powder, leaving a massive blood-rich haunch wrapped in clean canvas on the threshold. He spent agonizing hours outside in the gale, reinforcing the crumbling exterior of the logging cabin. He packed the rotting gaps between the heavy logs with a freezing mortar of mud pine needles and packed snow painstakingly, sealing off the lethal drafts that threatened to extinguish her fragile fire. He fixed the broken hinges on the door with scraps of leather and rigged a heavy makeshift crossbar from a thick pine branch, reinforcing the door from the outside while she secured it from within. Through it all, Cora stayed hidden behind the wood. But Elias knew she was watching him through the splintered cracks of the boarded-up window, her finger resting cautiously on the trigger of the Winchester. By the third evening, the relentless freezing hostility radiating from the cabin began to thaw, mirroring the slow, painful return of warmth to Cora's extremities. The constant roaring fire and the rich, fat, heavy venison broth Elias had provided had worked a small miracle. When Elias stepped inside that night to drop another heavy load of split wood onto the hearth, the atmosphere had shifted.
The interior no longer smelled of death and damp rot. It smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. The sickly, translucent pallor of Cora's skin had been replaced by a flush of returning life, and the violent, exhausting tremors that had racked her small frame had finally subsided. She was sitting on her straw pallet, her knees pulled to her chest. When Elias entered, she didn't raise the rifle. It still rested near her hand, but her grip was loose, her knuckles no longer white with tension. She was tough, Elias realized. Tougher than rawhide and old leather. You sleep out there in the timber, Cora said quietly. It wasn't a question. Her voice had lost its raw, raspy edge, revealing a softer, though profoundly weary cadence.
Elias knelt by the hearth, meticulously stacking the split wood so it would dry out without catching a stray spark. He didn't look at her, giving her the space she clearly needed. The timber is quiet, Mrs. Vance. You'll freeze to death, she stated, wrapping the moth-eaten wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. I've survived worse winters than this, Elias replied, his deep voice a comforting rumble in the small, fire-lit room. He took out his hunting knife and began whittling a piece of kindling, the methodical shh of the steel against the wood filling the silence. The cold only takes you if you stop respecting it. Cora watched his large, scarred hands work the wood. For the first time, the paranoid intensity in her eyes softened into something resembling fragile trust. She let out a long, shaky breath as if a heavy weight was slowly sliding off her chest. My husband was a prospector, Cora said, softly staring deep into the dancing orange flames. Josiah. We had a small claim down near Silver Bow. It wasn't much, just a patch of dirt and freezing water, but it was ours. We worked it for 3 years. We finally hit a vein last month, a good one. We kept it quiet, or so we thought we did. Elias stopped whittling. He didn't turn his head, but his entire posture shifted, listening intently to the rhythm of her words. A gang of riders came into our camp 3 weeks ago, Cora continued, her hands tightening unconsciously around the fabric of her blanket. Men who would rather steal a man's sweat and blood than work for their own. They shot Josiah in the back while he was washing his tools at the creek. I was in the tent. I managed to grab the saddlebag with our gold dust and run to the horses. They tracked me for a week, pushed me higher and higher into the bitter peaks until the blizzard hit. I holed up in this cabin. I think the storm finally killed them. Or at least I pray to God it did. Elias remained perfectly still. The wind shrieked a mournful tune against the roof, rattling the wooden boards. It was a tragic, heartbreaking story. It was a perfectly believable story for the harsh realities of the Montana Territory.
It was also a complete lie.
Elias Thorne was a man who survived by reading the silent, hidden language of the world around him. He noticed the small, seemingly insignificant details that other men ignored. Over the past 3 days, he had been observing Cora Vance just as closely as she had been observing him. He had noticed her hands when she reached for the coffee tin. They were small, but they were not the rough-cracked palms of a frontier homesteader, accustomed to scrubbing lye soap or panning for gold in freezing rivers. The calluses on Cora's hands were very specific. They were concentrated heavily on the webbing between her thumbs and forefingers and along the rigid insides of her knuckles. They were the distinct, undeniable marks of someone who spent their life tightly holding the heavy leather reins of a galloping horse and repeatedly gripping the cross-hatched wooden grip of a heavy revolver. He had noticed the way she moved. Despite her profound exhaustion and near starvation, there was a fluid, dangerous grace to her steps. When she picked up the Winchester, she didn't handle it like a panicked woman defending her life. She checked the chamber and cleared the breech with the smooth, unconscious muscle memory of a seasoned gunfighter. But the most damning piece of evidence had revealed itself earlier that very morning. While Cora had been in a deep, exhausted sleep, Elias had gone to the hearth to stoke the embers. A sudden violent downdraft from the chimney had blown a flurry of soot and ash into the room. Tucked deeply behind a loose blackened stone near the back of the fireplace, a piece of heavy folded paper had been dislodged, fluttering down onto the floorboards just inches from the flames. Elias had snatched it up before it could catch fire. It was half burnt, its edges charred and crumbling, but the heavy ink printed on the center was unmistakably clear. It was a Pinkerton Detective Agency wanted poster. The sketch face staring back at him was undoubtedly Cora. The high cheekbones, the intense eyes, it was her. But the bold letters printed beneath the sketch did not say Cora Vance, grieving widow.
It read Wanted Cora Black-Eyed Vance for the armed robbery of the Union Pacific payroll train in Cheyenne and the murder of 2 armed guards. Reward $10,000, dead or alive. Elias had carefully folded the brittle paper and slipped it into the deep inner pocket of his heavy coat. He hadn't confronted her. In the unforgiving wild, you didn't spook a predator until you knew exactly where all the traps were laid.
I am sorry for your loss, Cora, Elias said, now keeping his voice perfectly level, revealing none of what he knew. He resumed whittling the piece of pine. The mountains are cruel, but the men who roam them are far crueler. You don't strike me as cruel, Elias, she said, looking over at him. The firelight caught the amber in her eyes, making them look impossibly bright. Why are you helping me? Truly, you owe me nothing. Because a mountain man knows that an animal backed into a corner will fight to the very last drop of its blood, Elias replied, finally turning his head to lock his dark, steady eyes with hers. And I don't like watching things die needlessly. Cora held his gaze for a long moment, searching his scarred face for deception. She found none. She offered a tight, humorless smile, her guard dropping just a fraction more.
Josiah's gold is in the saddlebag, she whispered, nodding toward the dark corner. When the spring thaw finally comes and the pass is clear, I'll pay you handsomely for your trouble. We can split it right down the middle. It's enough money for you to leave this freezing hell ride west and buy a warm ranch in California.
Elias looked at the blood-stained bag, knowing full well it didn't hold a prospector's meager gold dust. It held the spoils of a violent train robbery, or perhaps something even more dangerous. I like the code, Elias said, simply returning his attention to the fire. He knew who she was. He knew there was a small fortune riding on her head. With one swift motion, he could bind her hands, drape her over his pack horse, and ride down to the lowlands to claim a reward that would keep him in powder and provisions for the rest of his natural life. But as Elias watched her pull the blanket tighter around her fragile frame, listening to the wind scream outside, he felt the heavy weight of the Pinkerton poster in his pocket. He remembered the blood on her coat. He remembered the sheer terror in her voice on that first day.
Cora Vance was a wanted criminal, a train robber, and a supposed murderer. But right now, sitting in the dirt of a freezing cabin, she was just a broken woman desperately trying to survive in a world that wanted to grind her into the snow. Elias had seen enough death in his life. He had handed out enough harsh justice when he wore the Tin Star.
He didn't care about the railroad's money. He cared about the fragile, beating heart in front of him. He made his choice. He would keep her secret, and he would keep her alive no matter what came up the mountain to claim her. That night, Elias did not return to his cold camp in the rocks. He told Cora that a new front was moving in and the temperature was dropping too fast. He took the far corner of the cramped cabin, resting his head against his heavy saddle. He closed his eyes, feigning sleep, listening to the rhythmic, comforting sound of her breathing over the crackle of the fire. But Elias was not sleeping. His hand rested firmly on the cold iron of his revolver. The wind was changing, and with it, he could smell something metallic and unnatural on the breeze creeping through the logs. The wolves were coming. Around 2 a.m, the rhythm of the mountain changed. The howling wind did not die down, but the pitch shifted, dropping into a low guttural moan that vibrated through the rotting floorboards. Elias Thorne lay motionless in the dark corner of the cabin, his breathing slow and measured, mimicking the deep slumber of a weary man. But beneath the heavy wolf pelts, every muscle in his large frame was coiled tight as a watch spring.
He heard the sound before Cora did. It was faint, almost entirely swallowed by the blizzard. But to a man who had spent a decade hunting fugitives and surviving predators, it was as loud as a gunshot. Crunch, pause, crunch.
It was the heavy rhythmic compression of snow beneath leather boots, and it was not just a lone wanderer. The footfalls were staggered, cautious, circling the perimeter of the cabin just beyond the reach of the faint light leaking through the cracks in the walls. Elias opened his eyes a fraction. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing ruby-red embers, casting long, twisting shadows across the small room. Cora was asleep on her pallet, wrapped tightly in her blanket, her face pale in the dim light. She looked peaceful, a stark contrast to the violence that was currently pacing right outside their door. Elias did not move to wake her. He needed to know what they were dealing with. He listened intently, mapping the invisible movements outside. There was one man near the boarded-up window, another lingering by the rear of the cabin where the snowdrift piled high against the logs. They were scouts. The storm that had trapped Cora in this icy tomb had not killed her pursuers. It had merely delayed them. The severe drop in temperature over the last 48 hours had frozen the top layer of the deep powder into a thick, hard crust. The wolves were no longer sinking. They were walking on top of the snow. They had found her. The footsteps eventually faded, retreating back into the dense, black timber line to wait for the dawn. Elias waited another hour to ensure they were gone before he silently rose from his makeshift bed. He stoked the embers, adding a few pieces of dry pine to bring a low, warm flame back to life. Then he moved to the door, checking the heavy wooden crossbar. It was secure, but it wouldn't hold against a determined assault. When the first gray light of morning finally began to filter through the gaps in the wood, Cora stirred. She sat up slowly, wincing as the stiff, cold air hit her joints. She immediately reached for the Winchester rifle, pulling it onto her lap. It was a reflex born of sheer trauma. "Morning," Elias said quietly from the hearth, pouring a steaming cup of chicory coffee and setting it on the floor between them. "You're up early," she noted, her voice still thick with sleep. She wrapped her hands around the hot tin cup, shivering as the residual cold of the night left her bones. "The mountain wakes up before the sun," Elias replied cryptically. He sat back on his heels, watching her carefully. The time for half-truths and polite fictions had run out. If they were going to survive the day, he needed her to trust him completely, and that meant burning away the lies. He reached deep into the inside pocket of his heavy canvas coat. His large scarred hand emerged, holding the folded, partially burned piece of paper. He didn't say a word. He simply leaned forward and placed the Pinkerton Wanted poster face up on the floorboards right next to her coffee cup. The firelight danced across the charred edges, illuminating the sketch face and the bold, damning letters: "Wanted Cora Black-Eyed Vance. Reward $10,000." Cora's reaction was instantaneous and violent. The coffee cup slipped from her hand, spilling dark, scalding liquid across the floorboards. She threw herself backward, scrambling against the wall, and leveled the Winchester directly at Elias's chest. The metallic clack of the hammer being pulled back sounded deafening in the small room. Her hazel eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. The fragile trust they had built over the last 3 days shattered instantly into a million jagged pieces. "You son of a bitch," she hissed, her hands trembling so violently the barrel of the rifle shook. "You were just waiting for me to get strong enough to walk down the mountain so you could collect the bounty." Elias did not flinch. He didn't reach for his own weapon. He simply sat there, his hands resting easily on his knees, an imposing, immovable mountain of a man. "If I wanted the bounty, Cora," Elias said, his voice a low, soothing rumble, completely devoid of threat, "you would have woken up bound and roped 3 days ago. If I wanted you dead, I would have let you freeze the day I found you. Put the rifle down. You are pointing it at the only friend you have left in this world." Cora's breathing was erratic, harsh gasp tearing at her throat. She stared at the poster, then back at Elias, her mind desperately trying to reconcile the gentleman who had chopped her firewood with the reality of her exposure.
"I found it yesterday morning tucked behind the stones in the chimney," Elias continued softly. "You tried to burn it, but the draft blew it back. I have known who you are since yesterday. I am still sitting here. Put the rifle down."
Slowly, agonizingly, the tension began to drain from her shoulders. The realization that he could have taken her at any moment, but chose to protect her instead, finally broke through her panic. She lowered the Winchester, letting the barrel rest on the floor, and buried her face in her hands. A single, ragged sob tore from her chest.
"It's not what you think," she wept, her voice muffled by her fingers. "I didn't murder those guards. I didn't want any of this."
"I know," Elias said. "So tell me the truth. Because the men who printed that poster were walking around this cabin while you slept last night. They have found us."
Cora's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face instantly draining of whatever color was left. "They're here, Harlan Cross." "If Harlan Cross is the man leading the hunting party, then yes," Elias confirmed grimly. "There were at least 2 scouts tracking the perimeter. They are waiting for the rest of their men to move up the ravine. We have hours, maybe less. Tell me what is really in that saddlebag, Cora, because no one sends a heavy posse up Whispering Hollow in the middle of a blizzard for $10,000. The risk is too high. You took something else, something they cannot afford to lose."
Cora stared at him, wiping a trembling hand across her soot-stained cheek. She looked at the bloody saddlebag resting in the corner, then back to the imposing frontier man who had appointed himself her guardian. She reached over, pulled the heavy leather bag onto her lap, and unbuckled the brass straps. She reached inside, bypassing the heavy canvas sacks of gold dust, and pulled out a thick leather-bound book. The cover was stained with the same dark rusted blood that coated her coat.
"Josiah was real," Cora said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper, thick with unresolved grief. "We really were prospectors, but we didn't strike silver. The Union Pacific Railroad wanted our land to build a new spur line through the valley. They didn't want to buy it. They sent Harlan Cross and his men to clear the right of way."
She ran a trembling finger over the bloody leather cover. They came in the night. They dragged Josiah out of our tent and shot him in the dirt. They were laughing. I hid under the floorboards of our wagon. The next day I tracked them to Cheyenne. I didn't care about living anymore. I just wanted to hurt them. Elias listened, his jaw set into a hard, unforgiving line. As a former lawman, he knew the brutal tactics of the railroad barons. They operated above the law, employing ruthless thugs with badges to slaughter innocent homesteaders and steal the frontier piece by piece. I found out they were moving a payroll train, Cora continued, her eyes hardening with a cold, desperate fire. I robbed it. The goal was just back pay for my husband's life, but I didn't shoot those guards. Harlan Cross did. He shot his own men to make it look like a massacre, to ensure the Pinkertons would hunt me to the ends of the earth. But while I was in the rail car, I found this in the safe. She held out the ledger. Elias took it gently. He opened the heavy pages. The flickering firelight illuminated rows upon rows of neat handwritten accounting. But it wasn't just numbers. It was names, dates, locations, and next to each homesteader's name was a sum of money paid out to men like Harlan Cross. It was a meticulously kept record of murder sanctioned and funded by the most powerful men in the country. It was absolute proof of a massive, bloody conspiracy. If this ledger makes it to a federal judge in the East, Cora whispered, the entire Union Pacific land syndicate will hang. That is why Cross chased me into the blizzard. That is why they won't stop until I am dead and this book is ash. Elias closed the ledger. The heavy thud of the leather pages felt like a judge's gavel striking wood. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying clarity. This wasn't a simple robbery. This was a war over the very soul of the frontier. And Elias Thorne had just placed himself squarely in the crossfire against an army of corporate assassins.
They murdered your husband, Elias said quietly, his dark eyes locking onto hers.
Yes, she breathed. Elias slowly stood up. He walked over to where his heavy Sharps .50, 90 Buffalo rifle leaned against the wall. He picked it up, checking the breech, his movements precise and deadly calm. He reached into his canvas sack and began pulling out heavy brass cartridges, lining them up methodically on the stone hearth. What are you doing? Cora asked, her voice tight with rising panic. Elias, if Cross is out there, there are at least 10 of them. Professional killers. We have to run. Running in this snow will only exhaust us, Elias replied, his tone as cold and hard as the ice outside. They have horses waiting below the tree line. We would be cut down before we made it a mile. He turned to face her, his massive silhouette blocking out the firelight. I used to wear a 10-star Cora. I gave it up because the law in this territory is a piece of paper bought and paid for by men in silk suits. But out here in the cold, there is a different kind of law. He tossed her a heavy box of Winchester ammunition. She caught it instinctively. Load your weapon, Mrs. Vance, Elias ordered softly. We are not running. The sun began to set, plunging Whispering Hollow back into a suffocating, freezing darkness. The wind howled with renewed fury, masking the sounds of the encroaching night. Inside the cabin, the fire was reduced to a low, smokeless simmer. Elias stood, positioned perfectly in the deep shadows beside the boarded-up window, his heavy rifle resting on a small gap in the planks. Cora lay flat on her stomach near the door, her rifle aimed straight at the heavy oak. The silence inside was thick-heavy with the metallic taste of adrenaline and fear. Then the wind died down for just a fraction of a second.
Cora Vance?
The voice boomed through the freezing air, echoing off the canyon walls. It was a harsh, gravelly baritone, dripping with arrogance and cruel amusement. Harlan Cross. I know you're in there, little bird, the voice taunted from the darkness beyond the tree line. And I know you ain't alone. We tracked a big man's snowshoes right to your door. You got 5 seconds to throw that heavy rifle out the window and walk out with your hands empty. You give me the book, and I promise I'll make it quick. Cora's breath hitched in her throat. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide with terror. Elias didn't look back. His thumb slowly, silently pulled back the heavy hammer of the Sharps rifle. And if we don't, Elias's deep voice suddenly roared through the cabin walls, cutting through the freezing air like a physical blow. A cruel, humorless laugh drifted back from the darkness. Then we turned that little shack into a burning coffin mountain man. Fire in the hole. The warning was not an idle threat. Before the echo of Harlan Cross's cruel laughter faded into the howling wind, the heavy metallic clink of something landing on the snow outside the front door registered in Elias's mind. It wasn't just kerosene, it was dynamite. Down, cover your ears and open your mouth, Elias roared. abandoning his post at the window and diving across the cramped floorboards. He threw his massive, heavy frame directly over Cora, pressing her firmly into the dirt and straw his wolf pelt coat, shielding her from what was to come. The explosion tore through the freezing night with earth-shattering violence. The heavy oak door fortified with thick ice and Elias's heavy crossbar was instantly vaporized into a lethal storm of jagged flaming shrapnel. The concussive shockwave slammed into the cabin walls, bowing the rotting logs inward and raining a thick cloud of suffocating dust, soot, and snow down upon them. The deafening roar left a high-pitched, agonizing ring echoing in their skulls. Before the smoke could even begin to clear, the tree line erupted in a blinding, chaotic strobe light of muzzle flashes. A relentless hail of hot lead tore through the shattered doorway and the boarded-up window. The bullets ripped through the cabin's timber with horrifying ease, splintering the wood, shattering the stone hearth, and filling the air with deadly flying debris. Elias rolled off Cora, moving with a terrifying calculated speed that defied his massive size. He didn't waste time checking if she was unhurt. He knew she was moving. He slid back to his position by the destroyed window, bringing the heavy barrel of the Sharps buffalo rifle to bear on the flashing tree line. He didn't fire blindly. He waited for a muzzle flash to reveal a silhouette against the snow. There, a man stepping out from behind a thick ponderosa pine, levering a repeating rifle. Elias pulled the double-set triggers. The roar of the Sharps .50, 90 inside the confined space of the shattered cabin, was apocalyptic. A massive plume of thick, acrid white gun smoke billowed from the barrel, temporarily blinding him, but the heavy lead slug found its mark with devastating precision. The man in the tree line was thrown violently backward off his feet, lifted entirely out of the snowbank by the sheer kinetic force of the impact. He did not scream. He did not move again. "One down," Elias muttered grimly, his scarred hands moving in a blur of practiced muscle memory. He dropped the breech block, ejecting the smoking brass casing which hit the floorboards with a sharp clatter. He slid a fresh, massive cartridge into the chamber and locked it shut with a heavy metallic clack. On the other side of the doorframe, Cora was fighting her own war. Lying flat on her stomach, coughing through the thick dust and cordite, she shoved the barrel of her Winchester 1873 through a jagged hole in the lower logs. Her face was a mask of pure, desperate survival. She emptied the magazine into the darkness, the rifle barking in a rapid, deafening staccato. She wasn't aiming to kill. She was laying down a wall of suppressing fire, forcing Cross's men to duck behind cover and ruining their aim. "Hold your fire! Flank them, you fools! Flank the cabin!" Harlan Cross's voice bellowed over the gunfire, sounding slightly more ragged, tinged with the realization that the people inside were not just going to lay down and burn. Through the gaping, smoking hole where the front door used to be, Elias saw the flicker of orange light. Two men were rushing the cabin from the blind sides, holding glass bottles of kerosene with flaming rags stuffed in the necks. "They are burning us out," Cora screamed, over the din frantically shoving fresh cartridges through the side-loading gate of her Winchester. The first bottle shattered against the roof. The dry, rotting pine needles and brittle wood beneath the heavy snowpack ignited instantly. A second bottle smashed against the exterior wall near the chimney. Within seconds, the interior of the cabin was bathed in a hellish dancing orange glow. The temperature inside skyrocketed the searing heat of the flames, clashing violently with the freezing air pouring in through the shattered doorway. The smoke quickly thickened, turning into a toxic choking blanket that forced them closer to the floor. "Grab the bag," Elias ordered, his voice an authoritative bark that brokered no argument. "Keep low." "Where?" Cora coughed, her eyes streaming with tears from the smoke, grabbing the heavy blood-stained saddlebag and dragging it against her chest. "They have the front covered. We're trapped." "I didn't spend 3 days just chopping firewood, Mrs. Vance," Elias growled. He slung his heavy Sharps rifle over his shoulder by its leather strap and crawled rapidly toward the back wall of the cabin, the wall that was buried beneath the massive sloping snowdrift. Over the past few days, Elias had meticulously patched the gaps in these specific logs with mud and moss, but he hadn't fortified them. He had intentionally left them loose, the freezing mud acting as a fragile, temporary glue holding the rotting timbers together. He drew his heavy hatchet. Rising to his knees, ignoring the bullets that whipped through the air just inches above his head, Elias swung the blunt hammer end of the heavy tool with bone-jarring, brutal force. He struck the center log. The frozen mud cracked like a pane of glass. He swung again, putting the full weight of his massive shoulders into the blow. The weakened wood splintered and groaned. On the third devastating strike, three of the heavy rotting timbers gave way completely. They collapsed outward, falling into the deep snowdrift behind the cabin and opening a jagged, narrow hole just large enough for a man to squeeze through. The bitter, howling wind of the blizzard instantly rushed in, feeding the flames but providing a desperate avenue of escape. Go! Elias roared, grabbing Cora by the collar of her heavy canvas coat and shoving her roughly toward the breach. Cora didn't hesitate. Fueled by pure adrenaline, she scrambled blindly through the jagged hole, dragging the heavy saddlebag and her Winchester with her, plunging headfirst into the freezing waist-deep powder of the snowdrift outside. Ilias followed a second later. Just as his boots cleared the rotting logs, a final massive volley of gunfire tore through the front of the cabin and the blazing roof finally gave way. The burning heavy timber crashed down onto the floorboards in a spectacular shower of sparks and ash, instantly turning the structure into a towering inferno of roaring flames. They emerged into a completely different world. Behind the cabin, the blizzard was an absolute whiteout. The wind screamed with a deafening ferocity, whipping the snow into a blinding frenzy that reduced visibility to less than 10 feet. It was brutally, instantly cold, the sudden temperature drop stealing the breath from their lungs. But the storm was their salvation. The roaring wind masked the sound of the collapsing rear wall, and the blinding snow hid their escape from the men surrounding the front. Elias didn't give her a moment to catch her breath or process the burning wreckage they had just escaped. He reached out, grabbed the heavy leather strap of the saddlebag from her trembling hands, and slung it across his broad chest. He grasped her gloved hand in a vice-like grip. "We have to move," he shouted, his mouth inches from her ear barely audible over the roaring gale. "They will figure out we are gone when the fire burns down." He dragged her forward, forcing her to climb straight up the steep, treacherous incline of the ridge, moving away from the flickering orange glow of the burning cabin. The physical toll was immediate and agonizing. The snow was up to Cora's waist, a heavy, freezing resistance that felt like wading through wet concrete. Every step was a battle against gravity and the elements. The thin mountain air burned in her lungs like inhaled glass. Her legs, weakened by days of starvation and inactivity, screamed in protest. She stumbled, falling face forward into the blinding powder. Before she could even panic, Elias was there. His massive hands gripped her under her arms, hauling her upright with effortless strength. He didn't offer words of comfort. He simply kept moving, breaking the trail using his massive frame like a plow to clear a narrow path through the deep drifts for her to follow. They climbed for what felt like hours, a grueling silent march through the darkness and the biting wind. The orange glow of the cabin faded into the swirling white, leaving them completely isolated in the brutal majesty of the Bitterroot Range. Elias navigated by instinct, reading the invisible contours of the land, avoiding the sheer drops and the avalanche zones hidden beneath the snow. Finally, Elias halted. He guided Cora into the lee of a massive, jagged outcropping of black granite boulders. The rock formation created a natural wind-scoured hollow, offering a precious reprieve from the biting gale. Cora collapsed against the freezing stone, her chest heaving, her whole body shaking violently from exertion and the returning cold. She clutched the Winchester to her chest, her eyes wide and staring blankly into the blizzard. Elias stood at the edge of the rocks, his back to her, staring down into the white abyss they had just climbed out of. He was breathing heavily, the condensation freezing into his thick beard. He unbuttoned his heavy wolf pelt coat to free his arms, shrugging off the heavy saddlebag. "They will track the trench we left in the snow," Cora gasped, her voice raw and panicked, finally finding the breath to speak. "As soon as the sun comes up, they will follow us. We can't outrun horses, Elias."
They cannot bring horses up this ridge, Elias replied, calmly, his dark eyes scanning the blinding storm below. The snow is too deep and the incline is too steep. They will have to follow us on foot.
He turned to face her. The pale, eerie light of the storm illuminated the hard, unforgiving lines of his face. He reached down and checked the cylinder of his Colt revolver, spinning it with a soft metallic click before drawing his long, wicked hunting knife from its leather sheath. "Where are you going?" Cora asked, true fear edging into her voice, as she realized he was preparing to leave the meager shelter of the rocks. "Elias, don't leave me here." Elias knelt beside her. He reached out and gently pushed the barrel of her Winchester down.
"I told you, Mrs. Vance," Elias whispered, his voice a steady, grounding anchor in the chaos of the storm. "I don't like watching things die needlessly. But the men down there, they are not things. They are monsters who slaughter innocent people for railroad dirt. And the mountain is very, very hungry tonight.
He stood back up, towering over her, a solitary guardian against the dark.
Stay hidden, he commanded. Keep the rifle ready. If you see a man step through that snow who isn't me, you shoot him in the chest and you don't stop pulling the trigger until the gun is empty.
Before she could reach out to stop him, Elias Thorne stepped backward out of the hollow. In the blink of an eye, the swirling violent whiteout swallowed his massive frame entirely. He vanished into the blizzard, becoming nothing more than a lethal ghost returning to the hunt. The blizzard did not simply hide Elias Thorne, it welcomed him. He moved through the howling whiteout with a terrifying absolute silence that defied his massive frame. He knew every treacherous ridge, every hidden drop, every blind canyon of the Bitterroot Mountains. He knew how the wind curled around the granite, and he knew how the cold crept into a man's mind, sowing panic long before it stopped his heart. The men Harlan Cross had brought up the mountain were dangerous killers, ruthless thugs employed by the railroad to slaughter innocent homesteaders. But they were flatlanders. They were men of crowded whiskey halls, dusty plains, and bright city streets. Up here, in the suffocating darkness of the Great White Death, their revolvers and their cruelty meant absolutely nothing. They were out of their element, blinded by the snow, deafened by the screaming wind, and rapidly succumbing to the freezing temperatures. Elias did not fire his rifle. The thunderous boom of the sharps would give away his position. He became a phantom, hunting with the brutal, silent efficiency of a predator, thinning a herd. He found the first two men stumbling blindly through a waist-deep drift about 50 yards from the burning remains of the cabin. They had lost their sense of direction, shouting to each other in panicked, ragged voices that were instantly snatched away by the gale. Elias rose from the snow behind them like a dark leviathan. A heavy leather-clad hand clamped over the first man's mouth, pulling him backward into the suffocating powder, while a swift, precise strike with the heavy iron pommel of his hunting knife to the base of the skull silenced him instantly. The second man turned his eyes wide with sudden terror as a shadow fell over him, but he never even had the chance to raise his weapon. The fear spread through Cross's remaining men like a virulent disease. They couldn't see the man hunting them. They only saw their companions vanishing into the swirling white-swallowed hole by the mountain. They began to fire wildly into the storm, wasting precious ammunition. The muzzle flashes illuminating nothing but the relentless driving snow. The chaotic gunfire only served to pinpoint their locations for Elias. He moved methodically, using the brutal terrain to his advantage. He drove one man toward a hidden sheer drop-off. The terrified thug simply stepped backward into the void, his scream lost to the abyss. Another separated from the group and half-frozen surrendered to the cold, dropping his rifle and sinking to his knees in the snow before Elias even reached him. Within an hour, the hunting party was broken, scattered, and decimated. Harlan Cross was left entirely alone, backed against the trunk of a massive frozen spruce tree. His arrogant bravado was completely gone, replaced by the primal shivering terror of a man who finally realized he was no longer the apex predator. He held a Colt revolver in his trembling, frostbitten hand, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. "Show yourself!" Cross screamed into the whiteout, his voice cracking violently. "Face me, you mountain bastard!" "I am right here, Harlan." The voice did not come from the storm in front of him. It came from directly beside him, calm, deep, and chillingly close. Cross spun wildly, raising the heavy revolver, but a massive hand lashed out from the shadows, gripping his wrist with bone-crushing force. The Colt discharged harmlessly into the dirt as Elias twisted Cross's arm, forcing him to his knees in the deep snow. Elias pressed the cold, razor-sharp edge of his hunting knife against the rapid pulse at the base of Cross's throat. "The railroad does not own this mountain," Elias whispered, his dark eyes staring down into the terrified face of the corporate assassin. "And your money cannot buy the weather." "They won't come looking," Elias said, his voice as immovable as the granite peaks around them. "Because you are going to walk down this mountain, Harlan. If you survive the cold, you will ride back to Cheyenne, and you will stand in front of the men in silk suits. You will look them in the eye, and you will tell them the absolute truth." Elias leaned in closer, the scent of a pine and gunpowder radiating from his heavy coat. "You will tell them that you cornered the widow in a rotting cabin at Dead Man's Creek. You will tell them she refused to surrender. And you will tell them that you threw dynamite through the door and the entire structure burned to the ground with her and the ledger inside. You will tell them there is nothing left but ash." Cross stared at him, his mind racing through the freezing fog of terror. He understood. It was an alibi, a way out.
And if I tell them the truth, Cross rasped, that she escaped,
Then I will come down from this mountain, Elias promised the vow, carrying a terrifying absolute weight. And I will hunt you through the streets of Cheyenne. I will find you in your bed, Harlan, and I will not be as merciful as the snow. Elias slowly withdrew the knife. He stepped back, letting the blinding storm immediately rush in between them, obscuring his massive silhouette. Walk, Elias commanded from the whiteout.
Cross didn't hesitate. Stumbling, shivering violently, the broken killer turned and began the agonizing blind descent toward the lowlands, carrying the lie that would set Cora Vance free.
When Elias finally returned to the jagged outcropping of granite boulders, the worst of the storm was beginning to break. The howling wind had softened into a steady, mournful breeze, and the heavy snowfall was thinning, revealing patches of a deep, bruised purple pre-dawn sky. Cora was exactly where he had left her. She was huddled against the cold stone, the Winchester clutched tightly against her chest, her eyes locked onto the white curtain of the storm. When she saw the massive familiar shape of Elias emerge from the darkness, a profound, shuddering sigh of relief tore through her body. She dropped the rifle and tried to stand, but her frozen legs betrayed of her. Elias caught her before she hit the ground. He wrapped his heavy wolf pelt coat entirely around her small, freezing frame, pulling her tightly against the solid, radiating warmth of his chest. It's over, Elias murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her cheek. They are gone, Cora. You are safe. Cora buried her face in the rough wool of his shirt, her trembling hands gripping the lapels of his coat. She didn't cry. The tears had frozen long ago. But for the first time since her husband had been murdered, she closed her eyes and actually allowed herself to believe that she was going to live. The ledger, she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. Elias reached down and picked up the heavy, blood-stained saddlebag from the snow. We will make sure it gets to exactly where it needs to go. But first, we need to survive the descent. The journey that followed was a grueling, agonizing test of human endurance. For 3 relentless weeks, they navigated the treacherous frozen passes of the Bitterroots. Elias kept them alive with pure instinct and an encyclopedic knowledge of the harsh land. He built smokeless fires in hidden caves, snared snowshoe hares, and broke the trail through waist-deep drifts. But it was Cora who truly surprised him. Despite her profound exhaustion, she never complained. She matched him step for step, her fierce feral will to survive, carrying her through the impossible cold. As the days bled into weeks, the hardened, guarded shells they had both built around their hearts began to crack. The sheer necessity of physical survival, sharing the meager warmth of a single fire, huddling together beneath heavy pelts to stave off hypothermia, the silent, terrifying reliance on one another slowly forged an unbreakable bond. Elias learned the sound of her quiet laughter when a snow-laden branch dumped a pile of powder on his head. Cora learned to read the subtle shifts in his dark eyes, realizing that the quiet, scarred giant was not a broken man, but a profoundly gentle one, who simply carried the weight of a violent world. In the frozen, absolute isolation of the wilderness, a quiet, desperate mercy blossomed into something resembling love. When they finally broke through the tree line and reached the muddy, thawing outskirts of a distant western settlement, they did not seek comfort or rest. They went straight to the Federal Telegraph Office. The blood-stained ledger, wrapped securely in oilcloth, was mailed eastward to a relentless federal judge in Chicago, accompanied by a sworn anonymous affidavit detailing the slaughter of the homesteaders. The fallout was spectacular, swift and devastating. Months later, as the spring thaw finally melted the Great White Death, the news reached the frontier. A massive federal indictment had shattered the Union Pacific Land Syndicate. Powerful railroad executives were dragged from their silk-lined offices in cuffs. Harlan Cross's superiors faced the gallows. The stolen wealth could never bring back the lives lost, but the bloody expansion of the railroad was violently halted. Justice, cold and absolute, had been served.
As for the grieving widow who had vanished into the blizzard, and the silent mountain man who had walked out of it with her, they simply disappeared into the vast expanse of the American West. The legend of Dead Man's Creek faded into mountain lore, a whispered campfire tale of a ruined cabin, blood in the snow, and a ghost who hunted in the whiteout. 3 years later, far from the freezing peaks of Montana, a small, prosperous horse ranch sat nestled in a lush green valley in the Oregon Territory.
The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the grazing herd. On the wide wooden porch of the main house, a tall, broad-shouldered man stood leaning against the railing watching the horizon. The harsh, unforgiving lines of his face had softened. He still wore a heavy canvas coat, but there was no rifle in his hands. The screen door creaked open behind him. Cora stepped out into the porch carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She looked healthy, radiant, the haunted feral terror completely erased from her striking hazel eyes. She walked up beside Elias, handing him a mug, and leaned comfortably against his side. Elias wrapped a large, scarred arm around her waist, pulling her close, resting his chin gently on the top of her head. They watched the sun dip below the mountains in absolute, comfortable silence. They had carved out something incredibly rare in a brutal, unforgiving world. It wasn't just peace and it wasn't just survival. It was a home. And for the first time in their lives, neither of them was running anymore.